A blood-red mask surfaces with no owner. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Share your city in the comments. I treasure each message. Let's begin. It was in the late autumn of the year 89 that Dr. John H. Watson, who had by then resumed a modest medical practice of his own, first heard of the affair which the newspapers were to christen the Crimson Mask mystery. Long afterwards, when the details had taken their place among the more remarkable of the Baker Street chronicles, he would often look back upon that chill, fog-laden evening and marvel at the peculiar chain of events which began not in Baker Street, but in a sombre house in Queen Anne Street, Marylebone. At the time of the occurrence, however, neither he nor anyone else in London, least of all Scotland Yard, had the remotest conception of the curious threads that ran beneath the surface of what seemed at first a brutal but straightforward crime. The house in question belonged to Mr. Erasmus Willoughby, a gentleman of some 60 years, widely known in financial circles as a director of the Metropolitan Colonial Bank, and a man whose name was synonymous with respectability. His habits were as regular as the chimes of St. Marylebone Church. He breakfasted at 8, received letters at past, and retired to his study punctually at 10 each evening, where he would remain, so his servants said, until long after midnight, working over ledgers and correspondence. On the night of November 3rd, the fog which had been creeping over the city all day lay thick upon the streets, muffling the rattle of hansom cabs and turning each gas lamp into a pale and sickly star. In Queen Anne Street the gloom was particularly dense, so that the front steps of number 17 seemed to emerge only vaguely from a grey, swirling void. It was shortly after 11 o'clock when Mr. Willoughby's butler, a respectable man named Graves, paused outside the door of the study with a silver tray in his hand. On it lay a single envelope, cream-coloured, of good quality, and sealed with a dollop of deep red wax, impressed with some curious design that Graves, being a man of method and not of imagination, did not trouble himself to decipher. He knocked softly. There was no answer. Graves, accustomed to his master's preoccupation with business matters, raised his voice slightly. "Your letter, sir," he called through the heavy oak. Still there came no response. The butler's eye travelled, as habit made it, to the bottom edge of the door. A narrow bar of light usually shone there after 10 o'clock, for Mr. Willoughby disliked to be disturbed once he had retired to his work and kept the study lamps burning late. To his surprise, Graves saw that the strip of light was absent. From within the room there was no sound at all. He hesitated. The servants' hall clock, which he could just hear ticking faintly somewhere in the depths of the house, had not yet struck the half-hour. It was unusual, most unusual, for his master to have extinguished the lamp so early. Yet there might be some simple explanation. Perhaps Mr. Willoughby had retired upstairs feeling unwell and forgotten to instruct that no further papers were to be brought to him. With this thought, Graves descended a short flight of stairs, traversed the central hall, and called softly to the housemaid, a young woman named Alice. "Have you seen Mr. Willoughby pass up to his room?" he asked. "No, Mr. Graves," she replied. "Not since supper time, sir. I was in the corridor just now with the hot water, and his door was still locked." Graves frowned. He was not an imaginative man, but the hush that seemed to lie upon the house, combined with the dreadful thickness of the fog beyond the fanlight, set his nerves strangely on edge. He returned to the study door and knocked more sharply. "Sir? Are you there, sir?" The silence which greeted him was more eloquent than any reply. After a moment he set the tray carefully on a side table and tried the handle. As he had expected, it did not yield. The key was invariably kept upon the inner side of the lock whenever Mr. Willoughby was engaged at his work. With growing uneasiness, Graves stooped and peered at the keyhole. Upon more than one occasion in his long service, he had resorted to slipping a note beneath the door. But even as he looked, he saw that this would be futile, for a strip of stiff card or paper had been thrust tightly into the lower gap, effectually blocking it. This, at last, was sufficiently out of keeping with the old gentleman's habits to drive the butler to action. He summoned Alice and the footman, Thomas, and together they went round by way of the garden, where a narrow stone path led to the rear windows of the house. "Mr. Willoughby does not care to have the French doors unlatched at night," Graves muttered as he fumbled with the key to the garden entrance. "But he is not the man to sit in the dark with the room locked about him either." The garden was a rectangle of shadow and dampness, bounded by a brick wall over which the fog curled in slow, twisting wreaths. The grass was slick underfoot, and the bare branches of a solitary plane tree rattled faintly in the cold wind. They rounded the corner to where the tall windows of the study looked out upon a narrow gravel sweep. Here at least there was some sign of life, for a dull glow showed between the heavy curtains. Graves stepped forward and tried the handle of the French window. It resisted. The bolt was shot from within. "Begging your pardon, sir," Thomas said, "but there's a crack in the curtain just here." He pointed, and all three pressed close to the glass. Through a small gap where the curtain failed to meet, they could see a portion of the study. The corner of a large mahogany desk, the arm of a leather chair, and the red gleam of a coal fire sunken low in the grate. Of the room's occupant, however, there was no sign. "Try tapping, Thomas," said Graves. The footman rapped smartly on the pane. They waited. Nothing stirred. A sudden dread took firm hold of the butler's mind. Without further hesitation, he drew a ring of keys from his pocket and selected one with a shaking hand. "Stand back," he said quietly. The key turned in the outer lock, but the bolt within still held. Graves tested it once, then stood back himself, his face pale. "I fear something is wrong, gravely wrong," he murmured. "Thomas, fetch a constable at once." It was perhaps 20 minutes later, though to Graves and the terrified maid the interval seemed far longer, when the garden gate admitted a uniformed officer of the Marylebone Division, accompanied by the breathless Thomas. The constable, a stout man named Briggs, brought with him a short iron bar and a polite incredulity which did not survive long in the oppressive silence of the garden. "Now then," he said, more gruffly than he felt, "stand clear, all of you." With a few vigorous motions he had prized back the inner bolt until the French window sprang inward with a protesting screech. A breath of warm air, heavy with the odour of stale cigar smoke and something else, something metallic, drifted out into the chill night. Graves crossed himself, an action wholly at variance with his usual staid demeanour. The constable stepped into the study. It was a large room lined with bookcases, the walls hung with sombre portraits in gilt frames. A thick Turkey carpet muffled their footsteps as they entered. The gas lamps had been turned low, so that the corners lay in semi-gloom, but the fire in the grate still glowed with a dull crimson heart. On the great mahogany writing table stood two shaded lamps, both extinguished. One had been knocked slightly askew. Its shade lay on its side, as though brushed aside in haste. An inkstand, a sheaf of papers, and a silver letter-knife were scattered upon the blotched leather surface. But it was the object upon the floor, a little way from the desk, that drew and held their horrified gaze. Mr. Erasmus Willoughby lay upon his back, his arms flung wide, the fingers of his right hand half clenched upon the carpet. His evening coat was disordered, one side rucked upwards to show the white of his shirt front. From the centre of that shirt front, just below the sternum, a small dark stain had spread outward and downward, trickling in a thin line to the waistcoat and pooling there in the creases of the cloth. More dreadful than the blood, however, was the thing that covered his face. Over his features, from brow to jaw, there had been drawn a mask of deep crimson velvet, smooth and seamless, with no openings for eyes or mouth. It clung to his face with unnatural closeness, showing the outline of the nose and cheekbones beneath, as though it had been moulded there. At the level of the eyes, 3 small slits had been cut in a triangle, each no more than the width of a matchstick. "Good Lord preserve us," whispered Graves, clutching at the back of a nearby chair. The constable dropped to one knee, his ruddy face gone a curious shade of grey. He reached out and touched the old man's wrist. "Cold," he muttered, "cold as stone. He's been dead some hours, I'll be bound." He made a movement as though to tug away the velvet covering, but at that moment Alice let out a thin wail and fled back towards the open window. The sound, and perhaps some half-formed sense of impropriety, caused Briggs to hesitate. "We'll have the divisional surgeon for that," he said, rising, "and the inspector. No saying what marks might be under there. Can't have a lot of clumsy fingers disturbing things." He looked around the room, blinking. There was, at first sight, nothing whatever to explain how death had come to the respectable banker. There was no sign of fierce struggle, no overturned chairs, no shattered glass. The carpet around the body was unruffled save for a faint, oddly shaped smudge near the right hand, almost as if someone had dragged the pad of a finger through a fine dust. The single wound in the chest suggested a blade, but no knife, sword, or dagger lay anywhere within sight. The windows were locked on the inside. The inner door to the hallway, when Graves at last fetched the key, kept in a locked drawer of the pantry, proved to be bolted as securely as the French window had been. The strip of card beneath the door, when withdrawn, showed itself to be a folded visiting card, its printed side turned inward. The name upon it, revealed later, would cause some comment in certain circles, but for the moment the constable merely glanced at the blank reverse and tucked it into an envelope. There was one curious detail which might have attracted a more observant eye, though Briggs, being overwhelmed by the gruesome spectacle before him, noted it only in the vaguest way. On the polished surface of the desk just to the left of the blotter, a small circular mark had been burned into the varnish, no wider than a shilling. Around it the wood was faintly discoloured, as though scorched by intense but momentary heat. Beside this blemish stood a glass paperweight containing a swirl of white sand that had settled unevenly, leaving a thin crescent of bare glass on one side. The constable stared at these things without truly seeing them. "Best fetch the inspector," he said at last, "and there'll be the yard to deal with." It was nearly 1 o'clock when Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived at Queen Anne Street, his sharp, ferret-like features pinched and weary above the collar of his overcoat. He had been roused from his bed by a message that promised something more serious than the usual housebreaking, and though he was a man experienced in crime, there was a perceptible tightening of his jaw when he stepped into the silent study and his eyes fell upon the crimson-shrouded figure on the floor. "A mask, you say?" he muttered. "Crimson velvet, and the room locked from within." He moved about briskly, asking quick, precise questions of Graves and the constable, taking in at a glance the bolted windows, the unbroken glass, the absence of any obvious weapon. He sniffed once at the air near the grate, frowning as though some faint odour, something sharp and unfamiliar, had pricked his senses. But whatever impression it made passed swiftly, and he turned his attention once more to the body. By the time the divisional surgeon had made his cursory examination and declared that death had probably occurred between 9 and 10 o'clock by a single thrust delivered with considerable force, Lestrade's expression had settled into one of grave perplexity. "So we have a dead banker," he said, half to himself. Alone in a room which no one seems to have entered or left. No weapon, no sign of robbery, and his face covered with this infernal contrivance. It won't do, Briggs. It won't do at all. He paced slowly from one end of the study to the other, his eyes travelling over the bookshelves, the heavy curtains, the mantelpiece crowded with framed photographs. His gaze lingered for a moment upon a gold-framed portrait of a handsome young woman, then shifted to the writing table and the small burned circle upon its surface. For an instant the inspector's thin mouth pursed, as though in speculation, but the thought, whatever it was, did not find words. "Have you notified the family?" he asked at last. "The master had no immediate kin in the house, sir," Graves replied, still pale but outwardly composed. "There is a nephew, Mr. Charles Willoughby, who resides in the Albany, and a married daughter in Torquay. I have sent messengers to them both." "Very good. We shall be in need of their statements. In the meantime, I must say there is enough here to keep half the yard busy." He paused, his keen little eyes narrowed. "And yet," he added slowly, "there is a look about this business that I do not care for. It is too neat, too self-contained. A masked corpse in a locked room is the stuff of penny romances, not of the Marylebone Division's case-book." He stood motionless a moment longer, then gave a short, decisive nod as though he had come to a reluctant conclusion. "Graves," he said, "you spoke just now of Dr. Watson, Dr. John H. Watson of Baker Street, as being acquainted with your late master's banker, Mr. Farquhar. Is that correct?" "Yes, Inspector. I have heard the doctor's name mentioned in connection with Mr. Farquhar more than once." Lestrade's lips twitched in a wry half-smile. "In that case," he murmured, "we may as well have the other gentleman into it from the start, for if ever there was a night when I could wish myself rid of the queer clients and the locked doors of London, it is this one. And if I cannot wish them away, then I may as well have the only man in England who seems to grow positively cheerful in their company." He turned up the collar of his coat and strode towards the door. "Briggs," he called over his shoulder, "see that the room is left exactly as it stands until my return. I am going to Baker Street." And thus it was that, while the fog thickened and the gas lamps hissed in the chill November darkness, a hansom cab was set rattling in the direction of that now famous lodging-house, and the strange affair of the Crimson Mask, already marked by death, mystery, and a velvet horror that clung like blood to the imagination, began its slow and inexorable progress towards 221B. It chanced that upon that particular evening I was once more a guest at Baker Street. My own practice, though respectable, was at that time still sufficiently modest to permit of my spending a good many of my nights in the old rooms, and Holmes, who alternated between moods of intense activity and profound lethargy, had sent me a brief note that afternoon expressing a desire for my company. I found him, when I arrived, stretched at length upon the sofa, a black clay pipe between his fingers, and his keen grey eyes half closed as they fixed themselves upon the thin wisp of smoke that curled towards the ceiling. The atmosphere of the sitting-room was thick with the pungent odour of strong tobacco. Upon the table near him lay scattered several foreign newspapers, a violin, and a small chemical retort which still gave off a faintly acrid smell. Mrs. Hudson, long inured to Holmes's peculiarities, had resigned herself to these occasional invasions of the domestic peace. "You are preoccupied, Holmes," I remarked, taking the armchair opposite him. "Is it work, or one of your abstruse chemical researches?" "Neither, my dear Watson," he replied, without altering his position. "I have been engaged in a trifling experiment in human nature. You will have observed, perhaps, that Mrs. Hudson has changed her laundress." "I assure you, Holmes, I observed nothing of the sort." "Yet the fact is as plain as the print upon your shirt cuff," he said, with that air of gentle superiority which never failed to amuse me. Our landlady's sleeves bear two distinct varieties of starch, the older somewhat greyed, and the newer of a purer white. The mixture upon the right cuff betrays that the new laundress is still using the old woman's irons. There has been a change within the week, a minor domestic revolution, Watson, but a revolution nonetheless. He smiled faintly and allowed his lids to droop again. "You sent for me to discuss laundresses?" I asked, laughing. "On the contrary, I sent for you because London has been intolerably dull for 3 days. When London is dull, I become introspective. When I become introspective, I am apt to experiment. It is well for the peace of the metropolis that I have you to distract me." He had just relapsed into silence when the sudden clatter of hoofs and the rattle of a cab upon the cobbles outside caused him to lift his head sharply. A moment later, we heard the jangle of the bell and the murmur of voices in the hallway. "Ha ha!" Holmes exclaimed, his eyes brightening. "If I mistake not, Watson, we are about to be delivered from ennui. That, unless my ears deceive me, is the step of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He comes late, which argues something out of the common, and he comes in haste, which argues something serious." Even as he spoke, there sounded upon the stair the swift, light tread which I knew so well. The door was flung open, and Lestrade stood upon the threshold, his thin face more pinched than usual, and his hat still in his hand. "Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble, "I am sorry to disturb you at this hour, but I have a case which is, well, I will not say beyond me, but pressing enough that I am not ashamed to ask your assistance from the outset." Holmes sprang to his feet with an alacrity that belied his recent languor. "You have done me a kindness, Inspector," he said. "Pray be seated. You perceive that you cannot be too late for my convenience, since I had nothing whatever to do. This is my friend and former colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely before him." Lestrade nodded curtly to me and sank into the chair which Holmes indicated. "It is a queer business, Mr. Holmes," he began. "A gentleman dead in his own study in Queen Anne Street, his door locked upon the inside, the windows bolted, and his face covered, if you please, with a crimson velvet mask. There is a wound in his chest, but no weapon to be found, and no sign of a struggle. If it were not that respectable men do not commonly die lying on their backs in masks with no one to see them, I might almost be tempted to write it off as some mad freak. As it stands, I confess I do not know what to make of it." Holmes's eyes had kindled at the first mention of the locked room, and were now gleaming with the cold, keen light I had come to associate with his highest flights. "A locked room and a masked corpse," he mused. "It has, as you say, a flavour of melodrama. Pray give us the facts in their order, no more and no less than you yourself have observed." Lestrade drew a folded paper from his pocket. "The deceased is Mr. Erasmus Willoughby, a director of the Metropolitan Colonial Bank," he said. "A respectable man, lived alone, save for his servants. Tonight, the butler became alarmed when he could get no answer at the study door, and noticed there was no light under it. Found the inner gap stopped with a card, which is unusual, and the door locked as usual from the inside. He went round by the garden, brought a constable, forced the French window, and found the body on the floor. Doctor says he has been dead some hours. Here is the card that was under the door." He handed Holmes a small envelope. My friend shook out upon his palm a visiting card folded in two. He opened it and read the neatly printed name. "Mr. Alfred Pennyweather?" he remarked. "You know the name, Lestrade?" The inspector's lips compressed. "A broker of some sort, I believe. The connection is not clear as yet. He called upon Mr. Willoughby a fortnight ago by the butler's account and was denied. The man seemed put out at the time." Holmes tossed the card carelessly upon the table. And the mask? We've left it on for the moment, Lestrade replied. I thought it best not to meddle until you had seen it. Crimson velvet, as I said, no holes for mouth or nose, just 3 tiny slits at the eye level. Whoever put it on meant it to stay. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze remote. A respectable banker found stabbed in a locked room, his countenance concealed by a crimson mask, an intrusive caller whose card is used to plug the door, no weapon, no disarray, and you, Lestrade, sufficiently puzzled to come straight to Baker Street. Yes, the case has points, many points. He turned abruptly to the mantelpiece, where his old clay pipe stood ready, then as swiftly changed his mind. Watson, your hat. Lestrade, you will be good enough to take us back with you to Queen Anne Street. There is only one place where such a puzzle can be profitably considered, and that is within the 4 walls which contain it. Within a quarter of an hour we were seated in a cab, rattling through the mist-laden streets towards Marylebone, Holmes leaning forward with his long fingers joined, his profile cut in sharp ascetic lines against the dim glow of the lamp. Lestrade, opposite us, gave from time to time a brief professional summary of the statements already taken, to which my friend listened with half-closed eyes and an occasional impatient movement, as though facts given in such order offended some inner sense of arrangement peculiar to himself. "You say the servants are above suspicion?" he asked at last. "As far as one can tell at a first glance," Lestrade returned. "The butler, Graves, has been in the family 20 years. The maid and footman both came with good characters. Their stories agree in every particular. No one has heard a cry or a disturbance of any kind." "That in itself is a disturbance," Holmes muttered. "Silence, where there should be sound, is one of the most eloquent of witnesses." The cab swung into Queen Anne Street and drew up before number 17, whose sombre frontage loomed out of the fog like the face of some watchful giant. A constable stood at the door, his cape glistening with moisture. Within, the house was very quiet. The hall lamp, turned low, cast long shadows up the staircase, and somewhere in the distance we could hear the subdued murmur of a woman's sobbing. Graves, grave indeed of countenance, met us at the study door. Holmes's searching gaze travelled over the man's figure and face in one swift, comprehensive glance. "You have not altered the position of anything since the inspector left?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," the butler replied. "We've been careful not to touch so much as a paper." "Excellent. You render us a service by your self-restraint." Holmes drew a deep breath as Lestrade turned the key and pushed open the door. The heavy odour of the room, stale tobacco, dying fire, and that faint metallic taint which I had already noticed in the hall seemed to meet us like something tangible. There, exactly as Lestrade had described him, lay Erasmus Willoughby upon the carpet, the crimson mask clinging horribly to his features, his limbs outflung in the abandon of death. For a moment even Holmes was silent, and I confess that I, though no stranger to violent endings, felt a distinct chill at the sight of that motionless figure with its veiled face. Holmes's reaction, however, was characteristic. In an instant he was transformed from the languid dilettante of Baker Street to the keen, alert reasoner in whom every faculty was bent towards a single end. He moved lightly around the body, his eyes travelling over it with a concentration so intense that his whole being seemed gathered into that one sense. "Do not come between me and the light, Watson," he said sharply as I stepped forward. "You obscure the only witness who has not yet been tampered with." I withdrew hastily while he dropped upon one knee and examined the dead man's hands, cuffs and shirt front with the aid of his lens. "Clumsy work, Lestrade," he murmured. "Not yours," I hastened to add. "Observe, Watson, the direction of the blood stain. The wound is here, beneath the breastbone, but the flow has taken an oblique course towards the left. That argues that the blow was delivered from slightly above and to the right, by a person standing close and facing him, not one who crept upon him from behind. We may dismiss, for the moment, the theory of a secret assassin lurking in a corner and springing forth. "The point is noted, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade answered, "but it does not tell us how the fellow got out of a locked room." "No," Holmes agreed placidly. "It merely reduces the number of available romances. We shall come to your locked room in good time." He bent lower, touching lightly with his long finger the clenched right hand of the dead man. "Nothing here, no scrap of clothing, no torn fibre. The nails are short and well kept. There has been no real struggle. Now the mask, if you please, but gently." Lestrade and I assisted in raising the head, while Holmes, with great delicacy, loosened the crimson velvet from where it seemed almost glued about the edges of the jaw and forehead. As it came away, I was aware of a faint, pungent odour, not unlike that of singed cloth mingled with some acrid chemical. "Ah!" Holmes breathed, and I saw his nostrils dilate. "You
perceive it, Watson?" "There is some smell, certainly," I admitted, "but I cannot identify it." "Nor I, as yet, but we shall. Put it aside for the moment." The face thus revealed was that of a man past middle life, clean-shaven, save for close-trimmed side whiskers, with finely cut features now relaxed into the blank apathy of death. There was no distortion, no sign of agony. One might have said that he slept, had it not been for the ghastly wound upon his breast. Holmes replaced the mask with as much care as he had removed it. "The condition of the features is important," he explained. "We must not expose them longer than is needful at this stage." He rose and began a minute examination of the carpet around the body, creeping about upon hands and knees with an indifference to appearances which Lestrade's conventional soul seemed to find almost shocking. "There is the smudge I mentioned," the inspector observed, pointing, "just there, by his hand." Holmes bent over it. "Precisely. Powder of some sort, disturbed by the fingers. Not cigar ash. The grain is too fine. We shall see to that." His eyes swept on, noting, as I now tried to note, each tiny irregularity in the soft pile of the turkey carpet, the faint drag here, the slight depression there. At one spot, midway between the desk and the body, he paused and drew from his pocket a steel measuring tape. 2 feet 4 inches, he remarked thoughtfully. "And again, yes, the same distance. Curious, most curious." "What do you make of it, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade demanded. "For the present I make a note," Holmes replied serenely. "We are still collecting our pieces. To fit them together prematurely is the ruin of all serious investigation." He rose and turned his attention to the writing table. The scattered papers, the overturned shade, the silver letter knife, the glass paperweight with its crescent of bare glass, all came in for his scrutiny. He lingered longest over the small circular burn in the polished wood. "You saw this, of course, Lestrade?" "I noticed some sort of mark, yes. I took it for a scorch from a cigar." "Did you indeed?" said Holmes softly. "Then I am sorry for your cigars. No, this is no mere ash. Note the regularity of the circle, Watson, and the extent of the discoloration around it. Something intensely hot and of uniform outline has been placed here for a very brief interval. You observe, too, the position, immediately beside the paperweight with the sand." He lifted the ornament, tilting it so that the white grains fell with a faint hiss against the glass. "Uneven," he mused, "heavier on the side nearest the burn. That also is suggestive." "To me it is suggestive of nothing whatsoever," I confessed. "That, my dear fellow, is only because you are honest enough not to pretend to see what you do not. It is a rare virtue even among detectives." He straightened. Suddenly, his gaze darting to the French windows. Crossing the room in 3 strides, he examined the bolts and the splintered wood where the constable's bar had forced an entrance, then moved on to the inner door, where he knelt to inspect the keyhole and the gap at its base. "You found the card wedged here?" he asked. "Yes," said Lestrade, "folded double and pushed in tight." "And you did not observe, in removing it, whether it was inserted from within or without?" The inspector coloured slightly. "I can't say, Mr. Holmes. It did not occur to me that it would matter." "It always matters," Holmes remarked, with no hint of reproach in his tone. "But we shall reconstruct it. Meanwhile, there is one other point upon which I must be enlightened before we go further. Tell me, Graves, during the last week, has anything in your master's demeanour, habits, or correspondence struck you as unusual?" Graves, who had stood all this while with his hands respectfully folded before him, drew himself up a little, as though the effort to recall the recent days steadied his shaken nerves. "Unusual, sir," he repeated slowly. "No, not to say unusual. The master was a reserved gentleman. He kept his cares to himself, if he had any. But—" He hesitated. Holmes fastened upon the word as a terrier upon a rat. "But—" he prompted. The butler glanced nervously at Lestrade. "Well, sir, since you ask, there were 1 or 2 matters that struck me as, well, being out of the common run. 3 nights ago I happened to be in the hall when the last post came in. There was a letter among the rest, addressed in a foreign hand. When I took it in to Mr. Willoughby, I found him standing by the fire with a paper in his hand and his back to the room. He started when I spoke, and I noticed that his own paper was also in a strange writing. He took the new letter very quick, and I could not help seeing that the stamp was from some place abroad, Spain or Portugal, I took it for, by the outline." "You had not seen such letters before?" Holmes asked. "Only twice, sir, within the last fortnight. The first time he locked it straight away in that black dispatch box on the corner of the desk. This last one he put in his pocket. After that he seemed more worried-like, though he never said a word." Holmes's gaze travelled to the black despatch box indicated. It was of stout leather with brass corners and a patent lock. "And you say there have been visitors?" "Only Mr. Pennyweather, sir. Mr. Alfred Pennyweather. He came first a month ago, and then again about a fortnight since. The master saw him the first time, but not the second." "What happened then?" Holmes asked. Graves shifted uneasily. "The gentleman was put out, as the inspector said. He spoke loud in the hall, said the master could not treat him so, something of that kind. I heard him say, 'You will live to regret this, Mr.
Willoughby!' before he went out and slammed the door behind him. Lestrade shot Holmes a significant glance. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he said, "we do not go begging for motives. They knock at the front door." "Motives are like mushrooms, Lestrade," Holmes returned. "The most succulent are sometimes the least conspicuous. This Pennyweather now, how would you describe him, Graves?" "A gentleman in his dress, sir, but nervous-like and quick in his movements. Dark hair beginning to go at the temples. Clean-shaven, I should say mid-40s. He had a way of looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be behind him." Holmes nodded. "You have the gift of observation in a modest degree, Graves. It is a pity you are not at the Yard. They lose more from the lack of it than they know." He turned suddenly back to the desk and laid his hand upon the dispatch box. "Locked, I perceive." "Yes, sir," the butler answered. "The master always kept the key upon his watch chain." Holmes's eye moved to the dead man's waistcoat. The heavy gold chain still lay across it, but the small key which should have hung there was absent. He raised the chain delicately with the tip of one finger and let it fall again. "That," he remarked, "is more eloquent than any foreign letter."
You see, Lestrade, our murderer or some other party interested has removed one thing and one thing only from the person of the deceased. We may infer that he desired the contents of this box, not the contents of the room at large. It may have dropped, Lestrade objected. Holmes's lip curled very slightly. Then let us do it the credit of being thorough, he said. Watson, oblige me with your eye and your patience. Lestrade, perhaps you will take the left side of the room, I the right. We shall see whether chance has been so accommodating. For the next 10 minutes, the three of us hunted every inch of carpet, skirting board, and curtain fold. Holmes's method was almost ludicrous in its exactness. He laid imaginary squares upon the floor and searched each as though it were a field to be harvested. At the end of our labours we had unearthed a missing button, 2 rusty pins, and a visiting card of an old acquaintance of mine, but no key. "There is your answer," Holmes said at last, straightening his tall figure with a little sigh. "The key has not dropped. It has been taken. That fact, coupled with the undisturbed drawers and shelves, narrows our inquiry very materially." Lestrade still frowned. "It tells us what the fellow wanted, no doubt," he admitted. "But it does not tell us who he is or how he got out." "The who will come last," Holmes replied. "It is the least important question. As to the how, let us not anticipate. We have still the windows and the chimneys, though I own the latter would be difficult even for a particularly enterprising criminal." He crossed to the hearth, knelt, and thrust his head and shoulders into the wide, old-fashioned fireplace. For some moments we heard his voice, muffled and indistinct, echoing up the flue as he muttered to himself. Presently he emerged, smudged with soot and blinking in the lamplight. "No footmarks, no disturbance," he said. "Only the normal accumulation of London smoke. Our murderer, then, is not a cat." His attention shifted abruptly to the photographs upon the mantel. One after another he took them up, glanced at the inscription on the back, and replaced them. At the portrait of the handsome young woman, whose image I had already noticed, he paused a fraction longer. "To my dear father, from Eleanor," he read aloud. "The daughter in Torquay, no doubt. A strong face, Watson. You observe the line of the mouth? It is the mouth of a woman who does not easily relinquish what she believes to be hers." There was a soft knock at the study door. Graves admitted the housemaid, Alice, her eyes red with weeping, but her curiosity overcoming her fear. "If you please, sir," she faltered, looking from Holmes to Lestrade and back again. "There is a gentleman in the hall asking for Mr. Willoughby. He would not give a message. He said he must see the master himself or the police." Lestrade started. "What name?" he demanded sharply. "Pennyweather, sir," she whispered. "Mr. Alfred Pennyweather." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Admirable!" he exclaimed. "The drama advances of its own accord. Lestrade, if you will have the kindness to bring Mr. Pennyweather in, we may perhaps learn whether he comes to explain his card or to account for his threat." Lestrade wasted no time. He slipped past the maid with a curt nod, and we heard his rapid steps receding down the corridor. Holmes, his whole being now strung to one tense expectancy, moved a little aside from the body and took up a position by the mantelpiece, where the shaded lamp threw his sharp features into light and left the rest of the room half veiled in shadow. "There are few more instructive moments in a case, Watson," he murmured, "than that in which a man is first confronted with a fact he has not anticipated. If this gentleman is guiltless, his surprise may still tell us much. If he is not, well, we shall see how well he plays an unstudied part." The door opened, and Lestrade reappeared, ushering in a man whose entrance, at any other time, would have betrayed nothing more than annoyance and fatigue. He was, as Graves had described him, of middle height
and slight build, his dark hair showing a thread of grey at the temples. The nervousness of which the butler had spoken was written large in the quick, jerky movements of his hands and the restless flicker of his eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Inspector?" he began at once, with the air of one pushed to the end of his tether. "I insist on seeing Mr. Willoughby. I have been told he is—"
"Engaged! Preposterous! At this hour! My business will not wait till morning, I assure you." His voice broke off abruptly as his gaze, travelling round the study, came to rest upon the figure upon the carpet. For one instant he stood frozen, his lips parted, his hands half lifted in a gesture he never completed. Then he took an involuntary step backward so that his shoulder struck the doorpost. "My God!" he whispered hoarsely. What have you done to him?" Holmes's eyes never left his face. "We have done nothing, Mr. Pennyweather," he said quietly. "You arrive, it seems, a little late. Mr. Willoughby is beyond the reach of your business, or of anyone's." "Dead?" The word came out in a strangled gasp. "Dead?" He took 2 or 3 uncertain paces into the room, his gaze still fixed in morbid fascination upon the crimson-shrouded head. "That thing on his face," he stammered. "What is it?" "A question we are all asking," Holmes returned. "Pray do not approach any nearer for the moment. You will excuse these precautions. We are anxious not to disturb any traces which may exist. You are Mr. Alfred Pennyweather, I think." The man tore his eyes away from the corpse with an effort and looked at my companion. "I am," he said, his voice steadier, though still shaken. "Who are you, sir, to question me in this manner?" "I came here to see Mr. Willoughby on a matter of extreme urgency, not to be catechised in his presence." "I am Sherlock Holmes," my friend answered, with his most imperturbable courtesy. "This is Dr. Watson. You already know Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. You will perceive that the matter of which you speak has, by a deplorable chance, become connected with another matter of even greater gravity. Sit down, Mr. Pennyweather. The sooner we understand your business with the deceased, the better for all concerned, yourself included." The broker, if such he was, hesitated, then dropped rather heavily into the chair Holmes indicated. His fingers fumbled for a moment with the brim of his hat before he set it down. I noted, even in that brief movement, that his gloves were damp and the shoulders of his overcoat darkened by the fog. You think I had something to do with this?" he demanded suddenly, his eyes darting from Holmes to Lestrade and back again. "Good heavens, man, I am as shocked as you are. I had no idea at all. I have come straight from my rooms in Jermyn Street. Ask my landlady if you doubt me. I've been there all the evening, writing." Holmes made a small, almost imperceptible motion with his hand. "We will come to the question of your movements later," he said. "For the moment, let us confine ourselves to what we know, not to what we imagine. You came here tonight at what time precisely?" "A little before 10 o'clock, Pennyweather answered. "I was turned away by the butler. He said
his master could not be seen and would receive no callers. I went back to my rooms then, but, confound it, I could not rest. Matters have come to such a pass with me that delay is ruin. I resolved to make one more attempt and came on here again within the hour. I had been waiting in the hall but a few minutes when the maid told me the police were in the house and that something had happened. That is the whole of it." Holmes's lids drooped for an instant. "You admit, then," he said softly, "that you have visited this house twice within the last 3 hours, and that on both occasions you were resolved to force an interview with Mr. Willoughby?" "I admit nothing of the kind," Pennyweather cried hotly. "I came as any man of business might come who sees his last chance slipping. I'm not accustomed to be treated like a mendicant, Mr. Holmes.
by you or anyone." Lestrade leaned forward. "You threatened him all the same," he said. "The butler heard you." "You will live to regret this, Mr. Willoughby. Those were your words." The man's cheeks flushed a dull red. "I was angry," he muttered. "A man may say more than he means in anger. I had lost heavily, through no fault of my own, I may add, in certain ventures in which Mr. Willoughby had encouraged me. When he refused me further assistance, I was carried away. But to twist that into a threat of murder is monstrous, Inspector. I'm not on your dock, sir." "Not yet," Lestrade retorted dryly. Holmes's hand came down lightly upon the mantel-shelf. "Let us not anticipate a jury," he intervened. "We have as yet no proof that Mr. Willoughby did regret his refusal, or that he had time to do so. You say you lost heavily, Mr. Pennyweather. Might I ask in what direction your losses lay? Colonial securities, perhaps? South American railways?" The other started. "How the devil—" he began, then checked himself. "Yes," he said slowly. "Chilean mines, Brazilian waterworks. You seem unusually well informed, Mr. Holmes." "It is my business to be," Holmes replied simply. Mr. Willoughby was a director of the Metropolitan Colonial Bank, whose prospectuses I have sometimes had occasion to admire. You, I gather, were one of those who admired them less profitably. Still, all this belongs properly to the realm of motives, and motives, as I have said, are mushrooms. Let us keep to our facts. When you came at 10 o'clock, did you see or hear anything unusual, either in the street or in the house? Pennyweather frowned, evidently ransacking his memory. "The street was as you see it now, foggy, a few cabs passing. I noticed nothing in particular. In the house, no. The butler looked flurried perhaps, but he always gives himself important airs. There was a smell—" He paused, his brows knitting. "Yes, I remember now. As I stood in the hall, I caught a whiff of some sharp, chemical odour. I thought at the time that the old fellow had been cleaning something." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed! And you noticed this at 10 o'clock? "Approximately. I did not look at my watch." "You are more accurate than you suppose," Holmes murmured. "You have been of service to us, Mr. Pennyweather, whether you intended it or not. One more question. Did you ever hear Mr. Willoughby speak of receiving letters from abroad within the last fortnight?" The broker's fingers closed convulsively upon the arm of his chair. "Letters?" he repeated. "From abroad? Yes, I did. From Madrid." He shot a quick, almost furtive glance at the black dispatch box on the desk. "He told me something of them," he added in a lower voice. "They were unpleasant, very unpleasant indeed." Holmes leaned forward a fraction, the light from the nearest lamp catching the steely brightness of his eyes. "Unpleasant in what sense, Mr. Pennyweather?" he asked. "Was it a matter of money, of reputation, or of something grimmer than either?" Pennyweather's tongue passed swiftly over his lips. "It was money to begin with," he said. "It is always money with men like us." But there were hints, veiled threats that touched the past. Willoughby spent some years in Spain in his youth. I do not know the full story. I doubt if anyone in London does. But these letters, he shivered slightly. They came from someone who did. Someone in Madrid who knew of certain transactions which, if brought to light, might have damaged him. "Blackmail?" Lestrade suggested. Pennyweather's shoulders moved in a helpless gesture. "If you like to call it so. The writer demanded remittances through certain agents. Willoughby spoke of it to me because I had myself interests in Spanish securities and some correspondence there. He thought I might assist him to trace the man. I made one or two inquiries, but—" he spread out his hands. "Madrid is a long way off, and men of that sort have long memories and short lives. My friends were not eager to meddle." "And the tone of these letters?" Holmes persisted. "Did it grow more urgent of late?" Yes, the last he received it 3 days ago was the worst. The fellow hinted that he was no longer content with money alone, that he might come to London, that it would please him to look Willoughby in the face once more. There was some phrase. Pennyweather frowned, searching his recollection. Yes, you shall not meet me without a mask between us. I remember it because it struck me as theatrical nonsense at the time. Lestrade uttered an exclamation, but Holmes merely inclined his head, his features quite expressionless. Most interesting, he murmured. And Mr. Willoughby's reaction? He was badly shaken, Pennyweather answered. For a man of his nerve, that is saying much. He spoke of going to the police. Then he changed his mind and swore he would
handle the matter himself. He locked the letter in that very box. I urged him to allow me to assist, but he put me off. That was the last time I saw him. After that came my own losses, and he refused me even the loan of his name. You know the rest. Holmes's gaze followed Pennyweather's involuntary glance towards the dispatch box. You have reason to believe, then, he said slowly, that there exists in that box at this moment at least one letter from Madrid containing threats couched in such a form that the appearance of this, his hand indicated the crimson mask, might seem the fulfillment of a promise. Yes, Pennyweather answered hoarsely. You may put it so. Lestrade rubbed his hands together. Well, Mr. Holmes, he said, this is clearer water than we had half an hour ago. We have a chain that reaches straight from Madrid to Queen Anne Street. Here is a man with a grudge who threatens to come in person. We find his victim dead, his face covered in a fashion that tallies with the threat. It will be a question of tracing our Spanish gentleman, that is all. No doubt, Holmes assented with a mildness that I, who knew him, found significant. Meanwhile, you will of course take every precaution to preserve the papers in that box from prying eyes. You will not permit them to be opened except in your presence, and if possible, in mine. I shall seal the room the moment we leave it, Lestrade returned. As to the box, it will go to the yard, if you please. We cannot have evidence of that kind lying loose. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the mantel-shelf. As you will, he said. Only I should be sorry if an overzealous constable were to mislay, in repacking, the precise order in which those letters lie. Arrangement, Lestrade, is the soul of inference. He moved from the fireplace and came to stand directly before Pennyweather, looking down at him with a grave, searching regard. One last point, sir, he said. You appear peculiarly interested in that box. Do you apprehend that anything it contains might be prejudicial to yourself? Pennyweather started as though the thought had been plucked from his own mind. To me, he stammered. What concern should it be of mine? I have told you all I know of those letters. I never saw them after he locked them away. Holmes's glance dropped for an instant to the man's gloved hands. With a swift, almost playful gesture, he reached out and took one of them between his fingers, turning it so that the palm faced the light. Humour me for a moment, he said. I am a connoisseur of gloves. Yours are of good kid. They have seen service tonight, but not hard service. No trace of dust upon the palm, no roughening of the seams. You have not within the last 2 hours forced a bolt, climbed a wall, or handled any object much more formidable than a cab door. That at least, we may say, with confidence. Pennyweather snatched back his hand. I know nothing of your tricks, Mr. Holmes, he said angrily. If you suspect me of laying a finger upon that box, you are at liberty to prove it. I came here tonight to beg a favour of a living man, not to rob a dead one. Quite so, Holmes returned calmly. You came here? That is the important fact. Lestrade rose. You will not object, Mr. Pennyweather, he said, if I ask you to remain at my disposal for a day or two? We may require to test your account of your movements. I shall take it as a favour, not to myself, but to justice, if you will accompany one of my men back to your rooms and hold yourself there, pending further inquiries.
"You mean I am under arrest?" the other cried. "I mean," Lestrade answered with official dryness, "that it would be unfortunate if we had to look for you and could not find you. You may call it what you please." Pennyweather's shoulders slumped. For an instant the fierce defiance in his eyes gave place to a look of sheer, haggard weariness. "I have been hunted enough of late," he said in a low voice. "Very well. I have nothing to fear from the truth, though I seem doomed to be suspected by fools and preyed upon by scoundrels. I will go." He took up his hat with a hand that trembled slightly, bowed in a stiff, constrained fashion, and allowed himself to be conducted from the room by the waiting constable. When the door had closed behind them, Lestrade turned to Holmes with a certain guarded satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he remarked, "I don't say he's our man, but he'll do to hold. Threats, money trouble, foreign letters, 2 visits to the house in one evening. It's not such bad material to go on." Holmes had moved back to the desk. He stood there very still, his fingers lightly caressing the circular burn in the polished wood, his gaze not upon Lestrade, but upon the glass paperweight with its crescent of displaced sand. "Material?" he repeated absently. "Yes, there is material in abundance. In fact, there is almost too much of it." He looked up suddenly, and I saw in his face that curious mingling of suppressed excitement and icy self-control which marked his highest mental activity. "You have your working hypothesis, Lestrade," he went on in a tone of courteous neutrality. "You will pursue it with your usual energy. For myself, there is one small point which absolutely refuses to fit into your arrangement. Until I can place it, I prefer not to disturb the rest." "And that point is?" I could not forbear to ask. Holmes's eyes met mine with a flicker of amusement. "My dear Watson," he said, "if I were to name it, I should be halfway to placing it. At present it is the loose thread that tells me the garment has not yet been correctly cut. Let us say only that something in this room is not as it pretends to be." He turned away, and his hand, as if by chance, rested a moment upon the folded visiting card which lay upon the table in its little envelope. "I shall borrow this," he added, slipping it into his pocket. "Also a few grains of that powder by the dead man's hand, and a scrap of the velvet from the mask. With your permission, Inspector?" "Thank you. I have certain tests I should like to make, and our friend in Madrid is unlikely to run away before the morning." Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. "You have your methods, Mr. Holmes, and I have mine," he said. "Only do not be too sure of Madrid. For my part, I shall keep an eye on Jermyn Street." "Do so," Holmes agreed. "Between us, we may chance to stumble upon the truth." 10 minutes later, we were once more in our cab, the sombre house in Queen Anne Street receding behind us into the fog. Holmes sat hunched in his corner, his chin upon his breast, and his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his ulster. I knew better than to disturb him when he was in such a mood, but, as we turned into the Marylebone Road, curiosity at last overcame discretion. "You spoke of one fact that would not fit," I ventured. "Is it connected with Pennyweather or with the letters from Madrid?" Holmes's answer was a low chuckle. "Neither, and both," he said. "Ask yourself, Watson, why a man who means to kill should trouble himself to promise a mask and then keep his word. When you can answer that to your own satisfaction, you will be nearer to the heart of this affair than our excellent friend Lestrade with all his motives and his mushrooms." The remainder of our drive was accomplished in silence. Holmes had turned his face to the window, and though the fog outside was so dense that little could be seen beyond the blurred glow of an occasional lamp, I knew that his mind was ranging far more widely than his eyes. It was close upon 3 o'clock when we let ourselves into Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, long since abed, had left a lamp burning in our sitting room. Holmes flung off his ulster, drew the Persian's slipper towards him with his foot, as was his wont, then seemed to think better of it and pushed the tobacco aside with an impatient gesture. "No, no," he muttered, "this is not a case for fogging the brain." Instead, he went straight to the corner where his chemical apparatus stood upon a deal table, lit the spirit lamp with a match, and laid out the few small objects he had brought from Queen Anne Street, the folded visiting card, the scrap of crimson velvet, and the faint, dust-like smear which he had coaxed from the carpet into a tiny glass phial. "You observe, Watson," he remarked, "that our entire edifice at present rests upon a foundation of the very smallest things, a grain of powder, a scorch in the polish, a trifling irregularity in a paperweight's sand. Lestrade, with his Spanish ogre, builds upon larger blocks, but they are not, I think, load-bearing. You attach little weight, then, to the letters from Madrid?" I asked, taking my usual chair and watching him with interest. "I attach to them exactly the weight they will carry," he answered. "They show that Willoughby was under pressure from abroad, that someone in Madrid knew enough of his past to threaten him. Very good. That may explain why a man dies. It does not explain how. The how is always the more fundamental." He uncorked the phial and with the tip of a penknife transferred a minute portion of the powder to a watch-glass. Under the strong white light of the lamp, I could see that the substance was of an exceedingly fine grain, whitish with a faint grey tinge. "Not ash," Holmes murmured. "Ash has body, even the most delicate. This is closer to a precipitate. Observe." He let fall upon it a drop of clear liquid from a labelled bottle. At once the powder seemed to curdle, forming tiny clots which darkened and then dissolved. "Acid soluble," he noted, more to himself than to me. "And now—" He heated a clean scrap of platinum wire in the flame until it glowed, then touched it to the dampened residue and returned it to the fire. A second later, a thin pale colouring showed at the tip of the wire, so faint that I should have missed it had I not been watching closely. "A mere trace," Holmes said quietly, "but characteristic. You see the faint lilac? Potassium, Watson, not from a coal grate, I fancy. This powder has more to do with a laboratory than with a library." "You think Willoughby experimented?" I ventured, "or that his assailant did?" "That is one of the pleasing questions which will keep us awake if we allow them," he returned dryly. "For the present we can register one fact. Whatever passed through that room tonight left behind it a chemical signature which is not part of the normal furniture of a banker's study." He set aside the wire, then took up the scrap of velvet he had cut from the edge of the mask. It was of rich pile, and I could see, even without his lens, that the inner surface was stained darker than the outer, as though it had been steeped in some liquid that had dried unevenly. Holmes sniffed it lightly, holding it close to his nostrils, then touched a corner of the cloth with the same reagent he had used upon the powder. A faint, discoloured ring spread outward from the drop, leaving the velvet stiff where it dried. "The odour is the same," he observed. "Very faint, but the same. It was stronger when the mask was first removed. Time is already robbing us of our most delicate witness. There is a relation here, Watson, the mask, the powder, and that circle upon the desk, but we shall not force it. The facts must come of their own accord." He turned at last to the visiting card. Holding it under the lamp, he examined first the printed face, and then the blank reverse with that patient minuteness which had so often revealed to him what others missed. His lens lingered at one corner where the surface showed a barely perceptible roughness. "Will you oblige me by shading the lamp?" he asked. I did so, and he drew a soft pencil from his pocket. Laying the blank side of the card upon the table, he passed the pencil lightly to and fro across it. Gradually, to my astonishment, faint, darker lines began to appear upon the whiteness, broken, irregular strokes, as if the ghost of some writing were summoning itself back from obliteration. "Someone has used this card as a blotting pad," I cried. "Precisely," said Holmes. "It has lain beneath a written sheet and taken the impression of the pen. Unfortunately, the hand was light and the writing ill-formed. Still, we have something." He bent close, his face almost touching the card. "What do you make of it, Watson?" I peered in turn. The marks were tantalizingly incomplete. Here and there a loop, the tail of a letter, the bare suggestion of a word. "It might be 10, I hazarded, and that, perhaps door. But I confess, Holmes, it is more imagination than sight." "You are too severe upon yourself," he said. "I read here, as you do, 10. Below it, this long stroke and break may indeed be part of a D. I think we may safely say that at some time a note was written above this card, which contained at least those two letters in proximity. Whether the writer was Willoughby or another is a point I shall leave open for the moment." He slipped the card into his notebook. "It is a small thing," he continued, "but it is ours alone. Lestrade has his Pennyweather and his Spaniard. We, my dear Watson, have a chemical residue, a scorch, 2 measured depressions in a carpet, and half a word. I prefer our side of the ledger." "You asked just now," I said, "why a man intent upon murder should promise his victim a mask and then keep his promise. Have you formed any hypothesis?" Holmes picked up the poker and stirred the fire thoughtfully. "A promise is a curious thing," he replied. "It binds in a way that a threat does not. Our Madrid correspondent was not merely menacing Willoughby, he was playing a part before an audience of one. The mask is not merely a convenience, therefore, it is a symbol. When a man kills theatrically, Watson, he usually intends a second audience, one that will hear of the deed afterwards. The difficulty is that there is more than one man in this drama who loves his effects." He cast a glance at the clock upon the mantel. Its hands pointed now to 3:15. "We can do nothing more tonight," he said briskly. "I shall send 2 telegrams in the morning, one to Torquay and one via our friends at the Foreign Office towards Madrid. Between them, we may learn whether Willoughby's past contained any feature that would justify so elaborate a revenge. In the meantime, sleep is the one rational course. I was in no humour for slumber, but long experience had taught me that Holmes's power of endurance was never so great as when he granted it the brief respite he now prescribed. I retired, therefore, to my old room, my head full of crimson velvet, scorched circles, and Spanish letters. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I was awakened by a sharp tapping at my door. I sprang up to find Holmes standing upon the threshold in his dressing gown, a yellow telegraph form in his hand. The morning light, grey and cheerless, was filtering faintly through the blind. "Up, Watson," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was an undernote that set my nerves tingling. "Our little comedy in Queen Anne Street has developed an unexpected second act. Lestrade has been beforehand with me." "Another telegram from the Yard?" I asked, taking the paper he held out. "Read it," said he. I smoothed out the crumpled form. The message, in Lestrade's curt official style, contained but a single line: "Second occurrence connected with Willoughby case. Stop urgent you and Holmes come at once. Stop." Holmes had me dressed, and in the sitting-room before the fire had quite consented to revive. "A second occurrence," he repeated, as he knotted his cravat with fingers that were perfectly steady, though his eyes burned with a strange inward light. You perceive, Watson, that our masked gentleman, or gentleman, is not content with a single performance. That is both our misfortune and our opportunity. You think it is the same hand at work? I asked. My dear fellow, if Lestrade has wit enough to associate the two, we may be sure the resemblance is not trivial. The question is where this fresh blow has fallen, at Queen Anne Street, at the bank, or— He paused for the smallest fraction of a second. At Jermyn Street. Pennyweather? Who better? Holmes snatched up his hat and cane. The man is either a villain or a magnet for villains. In either case, he repays attention. Come, there is a cab below which has been watching our door for 5 minutes. Lestrade is too impatient to trust to the post alone. He was right. As we stepped into the grey, raw morning, a familiar figure sprang from the cab and came towards us, coat collar turned up to his ears. I reckoned I should save time by catching you as you started, Lestrade explained. You got my wire? Holmes inclined his head. You spoke of a second occurrence. Where? At Jermyn Street, said the inspector grimly, with Mr. Pennyweather. Holmes's nostrils flared. I confess I am relieved, he murmured. I had begun to fear that our Madrid friend might be more efficient than picturesque. Pray, give us the facts as we go. Every minute that I do not know is wasted twice over. We were already in the cab and jolting rapidly eastward while Lestrade, his breath steaming in the chill air, sketched the story. I left a man with him last night, as I said I would, he began. Constable Rycroft. Steady fellow, no imagination, which is an advantage in some lines. They went back together to Jermyn Street about 3:30. Rycroft says Pennyweather let himself in with his latchkey. Rooms all in order, fire laid but not lit. The constable took a chair in the sitting room while your friend, as he calls himself, went through some papers at his desk. At 4 o'clock, Rycroft, being human, begins to nod. Pennyweather laughs and says he'll turn in. Shows the man his bedroom off the sitting room. No other entrance. Window giving on to a sheer drop into an air shaft. You can make yourself easy, constable, he says. If I get out of this, it will be through the keyhole. They agree that Rycroft will stretch himself on the sofa and keep half an ear open. And did he? Holmes inquired. As much as any man can when he's been on his legs 12 hours. Lestrade replied, with a touch of dryness. He owns he dropped off after a bit. Woke up with a start at what he took to be a cry. Says he can't swear whether it was in his dream or out of it. Anyhow, he jumps up, finds the sitting room door as he left it, but the bedroom door locked on the inside and no answer. Another locked door, Holmes murmured. Our invisible friend is an admirer of consistency. Lestrade went on without heeding the interruption. Rycroft thumps and calls, nothing. He doesn't like to make a row at that hour in a respectable house, but the silence gets on his nerves. At last he slips out, rouses the night porter, and together they fetch up the landlord. Between the three of them they force the bedroom door, and there he broke off with a jerk of his head, as though the conclusion were best left to the evidence. And there? I prompted. There they find Mr. Pennyweather, said Lestrade, sprawled across his bed in his clothes, insensible as a log, with a crimson velvet mask drawn over his face. I could not repress an exclamation. Dead? Cried Holmes sharply. No, that's the queerest part of it. Alive, if you call it that. Pulse slow, breathing shallow, no sign of a wound. Doctor has seen him, says he's under the influence of some powerful narcotic. We've had the windows open and the fire out this last hour. But he hasn't stirred. The mask is the same colour and material as the other, and there's a smell in the room like the one you remarked last night in Queen Anne Street. I wasn't going to blunder about in the dark a second time. That's why I wired you. Holmes's hands had tightened upon the head of his cane until the knuckles showed white. Excellent, he whispered, in a tone which, under the circumstances, struck me as almost shocking. The pattern repeats, Watson. When lines repeat, they may be projected. He relapsed into one of his sudden fits of abstraction. His head bowed, his eyes
fixed upon the floor of the cab as though he could see. There, the two rooms, the banker's study and the broker's bedroom, laid one upon the other like transparent plates. We drew up at last before a tall house in Jermyn Street, whose yellow brick frontage looked peculiarly mean in the cheerless light of early morning. A sleepy-eyed porter admitted us and led the way up 2 flights of stairs to a door where a constable stood on guard. Inside, the sitting-room bore the stamp of the hurried official intrusion of which Lestrade had spoken. Chairs pushed awry, a table drawn out of line, the hearthrug kicked forward. Holmes's eyes swept it all in one practised glance, lingering for an instant on the writing desk where a small, circular scorch marred the polished surface beside an empty inkstand. "Ah," he breathed. "Our friend is economical in his habits. 1 lamp, 1 device, 2 performances." Without waiting for an invitation, he moved straight into the adjoining bedroom. It was a small chamber, plainly furnished. The window, as Lestrade had said, looked into a narrow shaft, from which no human being could have descended or ascended without wings. Upon the bed lay Pennyweather, still fully dressed, his coat half unbuttoned, his tie awry. Over his face from brow to chin clung a mask of deep crimson velvet, identical, as far as I could see, with that which had veiled Willoughby's features. Even as we entered, the sickly sweet odour I already associated with the Queen Anne Street tragedy met us in a faint, clinging wave. Holmes crossed the room in 3 strides, bent over the prostrate man, and laid his long fingers upon the limp wrist. "Still with us?" he muttered. "The drug was meant to subdue, not to kill. That, at least, is a variation." With extreme delicacy he lifted the edge of the mask. I stood ready to assist, half expecting some dreadful revelation of disfigured features beneath. But Pennyweather's face, though pale and slack, showed no mark beyond the bluish shadows of exhaustion beneath the eyes. "Pupils contracted," Holmes remarked. "Breath with a faint metallic taint. Yes, yes, this begins to arrange itself. Replace the mask, if you please, Watson. I do not wish him to waken to a changed environment. His first words, when they come, may be valuable." Lestrade stared. "You mean to leave that thing on?" he demanded. "For the present," said Holmes curtly. "You have already removed it once, I suppose, to satisfy your very proper curiosity. You found what we see now?" Lestrade coloured. I took it off for a moment. Yes, there was nothing wrong with his face that I could see. "There seldom is with masks of this order," Holmes returned dryly. "The wrongness lies elsewhere." He moved back into the sitting-room so abruptly that I had some difficulty in following him. For a few moments he walked up and down with long, impatient strides, his hands clasped behind him, his head bent. Then, in one of his lightning changes of mood, he stopped dead, seized the poker, and began to probe the dull embers in the grate as if the fire itself had personally offended him. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "What on earth—" "Do not speak to me for 2 minutes, Watson," he cried. "No, do not look at me either. I cannot think when I am being watched." He thrust the poker in again and again until a shower of sparks sprang up, then flung it down with an exclamation and swung back to the desk, where he stood motionless, his eyes fixed upon the little circular burn beside the inkstand. "Inspector," he said at last, very quietly, "you will oblige me by sending at once for the doctor who first saw Mr. Pennyweather, and for a man from the yard whom you can trust to guard this room and its occupant from now until nightfall. I shall also ask you to place 3 plain-clothes men at my disposal, 1 at Queen Anne Street, 1 here, and 1 at the rear entrance to the Metropolitan Colonial Bank in Threadneedle Street.
They are to observe and report, but not to interfere, whatever they may see. Lestrade stared at him. "And may I ask, Mr. Holmes, what it is you expect them to see?" he inquired tartly. Holmes's lips curled in a thin smile. "If my calculations are accurate," he said, "they will see the man who wears the mask. And with a little management, we may contrive that on this occasion he will find it less easy to leave his stage by the usual exit." Lestrade, though plainly puzzled by Holmes's demands, was too seasoned an ally to waste time in argument. He dispatched one constable for the doctor and another for the yard, while Holmes paced the worn carpet with his head sunk forward and his arms folded tightly across his chest, like some lean, austere bird of prey waiting the moment to stoop. Within 20 minutes the medical man arrived, a brisk, sandy-whiskered practitioner from the neighbourhood. His report, delivered after a fresh examination of Pennyweather, added one more strand to the tangled skein. "Is as I told Inspector Lestrade," he said. "The man is under the influence of a narcotic, no doubt of it. Not opium nor chloral alone. There is a peculiar constriction of the pupils and a faint metallic taint on the breath which suggests some more complex preparation. The heart is slow but regular. With fresh air and time he will come round. There is no immediate danger." "No sign of injection?" Holmes asked. "No puncture on the arm or thigh." "None that I can discover. I should say the drug was inhaled. There is a curious smell in the room too, which I cannot place." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "You have been of much service, Doctor," he said. "I shall ask you, if you please, to look in again towards evening. I have a particular interest in the patient's first coherent words." When the man had gone, and the plain clothes officer had taken up his watch, we left Lestrade to arrange his dispositions and descended once more to the street. The raw morning had sharpened into a thin, pitiless daylight which showed every line of fatigue in my friend's lean features, yet his step was as light as ever, and his eyes held that cool flame which signified that his mind had at last seized upon a working clue. "You have set watches at 3 points," I remarked as we walked. "Queen Anne Street, Jermyn Street, and the Bank. You expect our man to move between them?" "I expect him to move towards the only point which still repays the risk," Holmes replied. "Consider, Watson, he visits Willoughby by night, employs a mask and a vapour to kill, and removes one thing only, the key of a dispatch box containing certain letters. He visits Pennyweather in precisely the same fashion, but this time his purpose is to disable, not to destroy." "Why?" "To keep him from speaking," I suggested. "To forestall some step Pennyweather meant to take?" "Precisely. But we must ask, what step could the man take that would be fatal to our assassin's design? Willoughby is dead. Pennyweather lies helpless. There remains some third locus of danger, some repository of knowledge or power which is not yet in the murderer's control. Where would Willoughby, a cautious banker under threat, place the ultimate safeguard of his reputation?" "At his bank," I cried, "in their strong-room." Holmes smiled faintly. "You justify my choice of companions." "Yes, Watson. If I wished to silence a blackmailer in Madrid and an indiscreet associate in London, and to lay hands upon certain compromising documents before the news could reach the city, I should find myself thinking very closely of Threadneedle Street. Our friend is economical. He will wish to make one journey serve." We hailed a cab and were soon set down before the imposing facade of the Metropolitan Colonial Bank. Business hours had only just begun, and a steady stream of clerks and minor clients passed in and out beneath the heavy portico. Holmes sent in his card with a penciled line, and within a short interval we were conducted to a private room where Mr. Farquhar, the managing director, and my old acquaintance, awaited us with an anxious face. "This is a dreadful business, Watson," he exclaimed, wringing my hand. "Poor Willoughby, the city will buzz like a hive when the papers have it. And now you tell me there is some connection with Pennyweather's collapse in Jermyn Street. I know your friend by reputation, of course." He bowed hurriedly to Holmes. "If you can throw any light on this, sir, you will do the bank a service it will not forget." "My light is of the dimmest as yet," Holmes answered. "I come less to give information than to ask it, and to make one request which, though unusual, may prove essential to your own security." Farquhar sank into a chair, passing a hand over his forehead. "Ask what you please. I confess, my nerves are not proof against much more. We hold a great many interests which do not bear sudden shocks." "First, then, had Mr. Willoughby any private safe or compartment here, apart from the ordinary director's arrangements?" "He had a separate iron box in our strongest vault," Farquhar said. "A personal matter, his own documents. We have never interfered with it." "Who has access?" "Willoughby himself, of course, and—" He hesitated. "And technically our chief cashier, Mr. Hargreaves, who holds the master key in case of accident." "No one else?" Holmes pressed. "No one. Even I require Hargreaves's assistance to open the inner section. It is a point of honour with us." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "You have communicated Willoughby's death to the staff?" "Not formally. There are rumours. The morning papers had a brief notice. I thought it best to delay any official announcement until after I had seen you. The directors meet at noon." "Excellent. Then the fact is not yet public knowledge. One more point, Mr. Farquhar. Have you observed any irregularity in Mr. Hargreaves's conduct of late? Any anxiety, any absence from duty?" The banker looked genuinely surprised. "None whatever. He is the most methodical of men. He has been with us 15 years. Holmes shrugged his shoulders almost imperceptibly. "It is in the nature of methodical men to be useful or dangerous. I must see him, but not yet. My request is this, Mr. Farquhar, that Willoughby's box be left precisely where it stands until this evening. You will resist for the moment any temptation to examine its contents, even in the interests of the estate. Further, I should be obliged if you would permit Dr. Watson and myself to occupy, after banking hours, some position within your premises whence we can command a view of the approaches to the vaults." Farquhar stared. "You anticipate an attempt upon the box?" "I anticipate that whoever killed Erasmus Willoughby is not yet satisfied," Holmes said gravely. "He has silenced the man in Queen Anne's Street. He has gagged, so to speak, the man in Jermyn Street. The third mouth he wishes to stop is made of iron and stands somewhere under your feet." The banker shivered. "You shall have what you ask," he said. "I would rather face a riot in the street than a scandal in my strong room. Come back at 4 o'clock. The staff will have gone. We can dispose matters as you think best." We left him and stepped once more into the clamorous city. Holmes drew a deep breath, like a man tasting the air before a race. "Matters march, Watson," he murmured. "By nightfall we shall either have a murderer in our net, or we shall have to admit that the Crimson Mask conceals an intellect more subtle than my own, in which case, my dear fellow, you will have a more dramatic obituary to write than I should altogether relish." It wanted but a few minutes to 4 when we presented ourselves once more at the Metropolitan Colonial Bank. Mr. Farquhar received us in the same private room, but his manner had grown, if possible, more strained. "I have done as you requested, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The staff know nothing. Hargreaves is in his usual place in the outer office. I have given out that we shall be working late over the director's papers. You will have the run of the lower floor when the clerks are gone. "Excellent," Holmes replied. "And our other lines, Lestrade?" The inspector, who had joined us but a moment before, drew a folded paper from his pocket. "I have had 2 reports," he said shortly. "From Queen Anne Street, nothing. The house has been quiet all day, but from Jermyn Street—" He consulted the slip. "At 1 o'clock this afternoon, a gentleman answering to the description of Mr. Hargreaves, your chief cashier, called at the lodging-house. He inquired after Mr. Pennyweather, was told by the landlord that he was still insensible and the police were in charge. He appeared much agitated and left at once." Farquhar stared. "Hargreaves, at Jermyn Street," he repeated. "What possible business could he have there?" "That," said Holmes softly, "is precisely what we are about to learn." The banker looked from one to the other of us, his face paling. "You do not mean to say," he began, "that you suspect—" Holmes raised a deprecating hand. "I suspect nothing," he answered. "I merely observe that our lines begin to converge. You will oblige me, Mr. Farquhar, by treating your chief cashier with exactly the same confidence as usual. At 4:30 you will request him to accompany you to the vaults to prepare Willoughby's private box for inspection by the directors. You will, however, suffer a slight lapse of memory and fail to join him there at the appointed moment." "A trap," Farquhar murmured. "A stage, rather," said Holmes. "We already have our actor. We lack only the moment at which he chooses to step before the footlights." The afternoon dragged itself out with that peculiar slowness which attends deliberate waiting for an impending crisis. The great banking hall emptied by degrees. The clatter of ledgers died away behind the glass partitions. One by one the clerks passed out into Threadneedle Street, until at last the place lay hushed beneath its high, echoing roof, with only a single porter moving ghost-like in the distance. Shortly after 4:30, we descended by a narrow stone stair to the lower regions. Farquhar led the way along a whitewashed corridor to a massive iron gate, beyond which stretched the strong-room, a low, vault-like chamber lined with ranks of iron doors. "You shall have this little room at the side," he whispered, indicating a narrow apartment which opened from the corridor just before the gate. "From its window you can see who goes in and out, and if you choose to leave the door ajar, you may hear a good deal as well. I am to send Hargreaves down at 5? "At 5 precisely," said Holmes. "Ask him, as you pass, to have Willoughby's box ready for the directors' meeting. Then forget us, for the present." When the banker had gone, we took up our positions in the tiny side room. It contained nothing but a table, 2 chairs, and a high, narrow window, through which we could see the length of the corridor and the gate of the vault. Holmes drew a small revolver from his pocket, examined it with care, then slipped it back into his inner coat. "I mistrust men who play with chemical toys," he remarked, by way of explanation. "They are apt to have unusual resources when cornered. You are armed, Lestrade. Good. Then we can safely allow our fish to enter the net before we draw it." The minutes crept by. From somewhere above came the faint murmur of traffic. From the depths of the building, the far-off clank of metal. Otherwise, the silence was complete. At 5 o'clock to the second, we heard footsteps descending the stair. A moment later, the figure of a man came into view, short, spare, with a neatly trimmed beard, and the precise, slightly mincing walk of one accustomed to tread carefully among columns of figures. He carried under his arm a small leather case, and in his hand a lantern of the dark lantern type. "Hargreaves," Lestrade breathed in my ear. The chief cashier paused a moment to set down his case, took a key from his waistcoat pocket, and turned it in the lock of the iron gate. The heavy grille swung back. With an anxious glance over his shoulder, a glance he would not have bestowed had he believed himself entirely alone, he passed within, taking up his case once more. The gate clanged shut behind him. Holmes's hand touched my arm. "Now," he whispered, gently. "We do not wish to frighten him before his time." We stole out into the corridor and moved, cat-like, to the half-open gate. Through the bars we could see Hargreaves at the far end of the vault, his back towards us, bending over one of the lower compartments. He had already opened it and was lifting out a small iron box which I recognized from Farquhar's description as Willoughby's. Upon the table beside him stood the leather case and the lantern. As we watched, he set the box down, opened the lantern a little wider to admit more light, and took from the case a curious object, a slender tripod of some dark metal, the feet of which he adjusted minutely upon the tabletop. From the same receptacle he produced a small, disc-like thing, no larger than a crown-piece, which he fitted into a holder at the summit of the tripod. Holmes's breath touched my cheek. "You see the 2 feet, Watson?" he murmured. 2 feet 4 inches between them, if my eye does not deceive me. Our old acquaintances of the Turkey carpet. A sudden thrill ran through me. Those measured depressions which had so puzzled me in Willoughby's study, here, surely, was their explanation. Hargreaves struck a match and applied it to the disc. A thin, almost invisible vapour began to rise. He leaned back a little, quirking his head to avoid it, then dipped again into his case and drew out, my heart gave a leap, a folded mass of deep crimson velvet. He shook it once to spread it, and I saw the blank, eyeless surface of a mask exactly resembling those which had shrouded the faces of Willoughby and Pennyweather. Holmes waited no longer. "Now, Lestrade!" he cried, springing forward and flinging the gate wide. We were upon the man before he had time to turn. Startled, he half rose, the mask still in his hands, his mouth opening upon some inarticulate exclamation. Holmes's grip closed upon his right wrist. Lestrade, with the practised motion of his calling, snapped a pair of handcuffs upon the other. "For heaven's sake," Hargreaves stammered. "What is the meaning of Mr. Holmes, Inspector? This is an outrage." Holmes wheeled him sharply away from the tripod, where the vapour was already thickening. "Stand clear of that," he said curtly, "unless you wish to give us more trouble than you are worth. You have shown us your apparatus, Mr. Hargreaves. We shall now ask you to exhibit your conscience." "I don't know what you're talking about," the man muttered, but his lips had gone suddenly dry, and beads of moisture stood upon his forehead. Lestrade pointed to the iron box. "You were going to open that," he said. "The box of a dead director who cannot complain, with a tripod, a lamp, and a crimson mask as your tools. It is a queer way of adjusting accounts, Mr. Hargreaves." The chief cashier's eyes shot a frightened glance towards the tripod. "It is a precaution," he faltered. "There has been sickness. One cannot be too careful. Germs." Holmes's laugh cut him short, cold, contemptuous, merciless. Come," he said. "Sickness, yes, but one of your own making. We have seen its symptoms in Queen Anne Street and Jermyn Street. You will pardon me if I extinguish your little toy before it adds the Bank of England to its list." With his handkerchief wrapped about his fingers, he lifted the disc from the stand and plunged it into a jar of water that stood upon a neighbouring shelf. There was a faint hiss, a little cloud of steam, and the unpleasant odour I had already learned to associate with the crimson masks drifted more strongly upon the air. "Potassium salt in combination with some volatile anaesthetic," he remarked. "The heat releases the vapour, the mask concentrates it. A very pretty device, ingenious, economical, and in the right hands, deadly." Hargreaves stared at him, his jaw working. "You cannot prove—" he began. Holmes's grey eyes flashed. "I can prove enough to satisfy a jury," he said sternly. Your stand left its hallmark beside Willoughby's desk and upon Pennyweather's floor. Your disc burned its circle into the polish and drugged your victims through the velvet you now hold. You visited Jermyn Street today to see if your second experiment had taken full effect. You come here at the earliest moment when attention is diverted from your normal duties to tamper with this box and destroy the letters which would show that the Madrid blackmailer is not in Madrid at all, but in Threadneedle Street. Do you still tell us that this is all a coincidence of office hygiene? The man's shoulders sagged. For an instant he struggled visibly with himself, then suddenly straightened. "If I speak," he said hoarsely, "it will not be to you, Mr. Holmes. I shall have the protection of the law." "You shall have it," Lestrade replied grimly, "and you shall tell your story at the Yard. But understand this, Hargreaves. There is a dead man in Queen Anne Street and another who may yet die in Jermyn Street. Whatever tale you tell, it will be measured against that fact." He signalled to the constable who had followed us down, and between them they led the chief cashier away, still protesting, but with all the fight gone out of him. Holmes watched them to the end of the corridor, then turned to the table and opened Willoughby's box with the key, which had lain ready beneath Hargreaves's hand. Within, neatly tied and docketed, lay a packet of letters bearing Spanish stamps. Holmes glanced through the first two, then handed one to me. "You will observe," he said, "that the hand which threatens in Spanish is the same which endorsed these in English for Willoughby's files. Our friend was economical even in his penmanship." The script, though skilfully disguised in the body of the letters, betrayed itself in certain peculiarities which Holmes had long ago taught me to recognize: the formation of the R, the hesitation in the S, the pressure upon the downstrokes. I needed no further proof. "It was he all along," I murmured. "Not Madrid at all." "Madrid supplied the background only," Holmes replied. Hargreaves knew of Willoughby's youthful indiscretions abroad, perhaps through old correspondence handled in the course of business. He saw his opportunity and created a shadowy enemy overseas upon whom suspicion should fall if the worst came to the worst. When his extortions grew too bold, Willoughby talked of going to the police, and also confided in Pennyweather. Our cashier, with the caution of his breed, resolved to destroy both the man who might denounce him and the associate who might unravel his fiction. The first he killed by combining his vapour with a knife thrust. The second he meant only to drug and intimidate until he could complete his work here and escape. It was a miscalculation that you, Lestrade, placed a guard upon Jermyn Street. Later that night, in the familiar refuge of Baker Street, I had the whole chain of reasoning laid before me in that lucid, half-ironical fashion which made Holmes's expositions almost as great a pleasure as his triumphs. "The locked room?" I asked. Even now I do not wholly grasp how he entered and left without detection. "It was less miraculous than you suppose," Holmes answered. "He was admitted early in the evening, in the ordinary way. Graves did not mention it because he never saw him go out. Hargreaves, on some banking pretext, remained after the others had left, bringing with him his apparatus in that same leather case. Once alone with Willoughby in the study, he persuaded him to don the mask as a protection against the fumes of a new disinfectant. Men of figures are easily alarmed where health is concerned. A few whiffs of the vapour were enough to stupefy him. Hargreaves then drew the bolts of the French windows, stepped out to see that the garden was clear, returned, stabbed his unconscious victim with the banker's own letter-knife, and carefully fastened the room. The key he removed from the watch-chain and pocketed. The gap under the door he later plugged with Pennyweather's card, which had served him as a blotter when composing one of his pseudo-Spanish effusions. He left by the front door with the composure of a man who has worked late at the office. But the windows were bolted on the inside, I objected. By means of a simple rod and hook passed through the imperfectly closed French pane, Holmes replied. You will remember that one bolt showed marks of recent strain other than the constable's. It is a trick as old as the locksmith's art. Our friend had leisure later in the evening to return, slip round to the garden, and complete the illusion of a room sealed from within. And the 10 upon the card? I pursued. Was it indeed part of some note? A memorandum, I fancy, of the hour fixed for Willoughby to expect his caller, said he. It served me chiefly to show that the card had been used upon the banker's own desk before being employed at the door. A trifle, but trifles are the most reliable of witnesses. And Pennyweather? Pennyweather, Holmes said, was less rogue than fool. He had guessed that the letters from Madrid might be false, and had begun inquiries. Hargreaves learned of this. Our cashier was an attentive listener when excited clients talked in the director's room and saw the danger. He repeated his experiment with the vapour in Jermyn Street, intending to keep the broker quiescent, perhaps even to persuade him, on waking, that he had suffered a stroke or seizure. In the meantime, he would rid the strong room of its incriminating contents and vanish, leaving behind him a legend of Spanish vengeance. The repetition of the mask, which so puzzles Lestrade, is merely the theatrical touch to which such natures are prone. When he wrote, "You shall not meet me without a mask between us," he was already rehearsing his part before an imaginary audience. I could not but shake my head at the cold ingenuity of the scheme. "And our friend in Madrid?" I asked. "Was there ever such a person?" Holmes shrugged. "There may have been once," he answered. "Hargreaves did not invent Willoughby's past, though he embroidered it. The Foreign Office wire tells me that a certain Dom Pedro Alvareda, formerly in business with Willoughby at Seville, died last year in prison. Our cashier took the ghost's name to clothe his own avarice. It is a common arrangement, in finance as in crime." I sat for some time in silence, turning over in my mind the various threads which had come together with such grim symmetry. At last I said, "And the crimson mask itself, what will the world make of it, Holmes?" He smiled faintly, stretching his long limbs towards the fire. "The world, my dear Watson, will see in it exactly what it wishes," he replied. "Some will find in it a symbol of foreign conspiracies, others a morality tale on the dangers of speculation. For me, it will remain merely one more instance of that curious human instinct which prefers melodrama to simplicity. Our murderer might have killed as effectively with a glass of drugged wine and a curtain cord. Instead, he chose to play at theatre, and so supplied us with the very clue that undid him." He took up his pipe, then laid it down again with a little gesture of impatience. "I confess," he added, "that the case had its points, the chemical device, the pseudo-locked room, the double performance in Queen Anne Street and Jermyn Street. Yes, there was material there. But in the end, Watson, it was the same old story, a commonplace greed hiding behind an uncommon mask." "And you?" I asked. "You were satisfied?" Holmes's eyes rested for a moment upon the smoke which curled upward from the fire, tracing vague arabesques against the ceiling. "Satisfied?" he repeated. "I have set the facts in order, that is all. Lestrade will have his prisoner, the bank will have its explanation, and you will have another chapter for your annals. It is as much as one can ask of a November week in London." He rose, took his violin from its case, and drew the bow lightly across the strings. "As for myself," he concluded, with that dry, half-whimsical note I knew so well. I must look elsewhere for a more worthy antagonist. Our friend Hargreaves counted his columns of figures too long to be truly dangerous. When the man behind the mask is nothing but a frightened cashier, the drama suffers, do you not think? Play something, Watson, from the Spanish perhaps. It will give a little reality to the villain whom our poor banker so fatally conjured out of the past. And so, while the fog thickened once more over Baker Street and the city murmured dully beyond our windows, Sherlock Holmes sat with his long, thin fingers upon the strings, drawing from them a low, brooding melody that might have been born of Seville or of London, or of that strange borderland between crime and conscience which his singular genius had made his own.